So I'm John Mitchell. I'm a Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning. I'm just here to welcome you to the event. We've had an exciting fall quarter as part of our Year of Learning with a number of different events, and I've seen many of you at some of the previous things. We will also have a winter and spring program. Some of them will seem like late-breaking news, but hopefully exciting when you hear about them in the winter and spring, focusing on different student issues, lifelong learning. We'll have a big conference here in April and other events coming up. So I'm glad to be here as part of that, and it's great to see all of you here today. I'd like to also announce that after this discussion we'll have today, we also have a follow-up workshop on December 4th, noon to 1:15 p.m., featuring Sherry Shepard and Jim Campbell. We'll have a flyers out, and since I think we know who you are if you registered for this, we'll get back to you by email and so on. I think without any further comments, we will launch into our outstanding series of comments, thoughts, slides, discussion, and I think there's a participatory portion of this. Yeah. So here we go. To my left, Carl Wyman, Sherry Shepard, Russell Berman, Robin Dunbar, and while I was traveling last week, they figured out some clever way of using the next 45 minutes and entertaining you. So I'm as anxious as you are to see what that is.
Okay, so just to start, we want to have you spend a few minutes on a little activity. And this is really intended to kind of get thinking about learning goals shifted away from, okay, this is some paperwork I got to do as official part of the teaching evaluation, to something that's more meaningful for you. And so what we'd like to do is have you at your tables think about your past experiences and kind of what you saw as were indications that you were successful in your teaching, things you can remember that students did that you sort of went away from that thinking, boy, they really got it. Or alternatively, you can get to the same place by thinking about things students did that you went away saying, oh my God, this really didn't work. And you can think about the inverse of that, of how you would like to change that. But in any case, go through this and just kind of reflect on this to come up with a few indications that, so we get a range of things, of indications people see of where teaching was successful, okay? And we'll give you about 5 minutes, or 4 minutes? I can't remember the exact timing. To 5, okay. So we'll give you 5 minutes, want you to note a few things down on this, and then I'll call on randomly 3 tables to just give 2 sentences, very brief things on this. And now, just from past experience in this, both in your table discussions and when I call on people, resist the urge to go through a full description of what your course is and your students, because that can get sort of prolonged, okay? And so just keep it brief. So with that, you can start to work. Okay, let's go ahead and proceed. There'll be lots of opportunities for further discussion and issues once we're through with the formal part here. So this just to get you warmed up. I see there are 2 mics, so my table selection isn't going to be that random because your qualifications are that you don't have your mouth full of food and people can hear you. So let me go with the second table back over there, which has a microphone nice and close to you. And
we found that getting direct feedback from students in several ways is hugely beneficial. One way is that several of us have had an opportunity to meet individually with students on a fairly frequent basis after classes were over, and often would hear from them things where they had actually changed course. Another way that somebody had here similarly to get feedback is an explicit survey that they created that they use religiously in all their courses to get feedback about the things they're interested in getting feedback on. They see it in the comment section there.
Sure. Somebody have a mic over there?
So a few things we came up with that might indicate that students got it was that the students asked lots of questions. In fact, that if they appear confused, it means they're actually thinking deeply about it. So that kind of confusion and asking questions. Another was that the students go out and emulate or practice what they've learned, often in an environment where it might not even be supported, okay, what they'd been taught. So despite that, still going out and doing it. And then another was if the students can give a compelling critique of the course, so they can give a constructive criticism, in fact, understanding what they should have learned and how they might have learned it better or how the course might have been structured so they could have learned it better. So those were three.
Okay.
And I just quick mention, one thing that happens to me that's very meaningful is to have a student come in after the class is over to talk about how the class has affected their career goals, and now they want to talk about the shift in their career goals based on the class. So that makes me feel as though it's worked.
Okay. Okay, how about the middle back table there?
Some of the things we discussed included students saying after the class was over that they had learned a lot, that something that they had been confused about prior to the course, they really understood now. And also, one of the other examples was students coming in and saying that something they'd learned in class, they'd applied it directly to their job and really been able to use that in work.
Well, we have time for one more. So.
Learning how to construct a dialogue across disciplines. I teach for 23 years now a global teamwork class that brings together students from architecture, engineering, mechanical, construction management, and life cycle financial management. So that's one. They have gone out into the industry and transformed the industry, one project at a time. And others went into academia and emulated the education model worldwide in Malaysia, Brazil, Chile, Japan, Norway, Switzerland. So it's a great ripple effect.
Can we get somebody else from that table?
So I work in a very small field, Slavic languages. So we always face the same problem, recruiting students to the major. And at the liberal arts college where I taught before, Colgate University, I was mostly teaching in the core general education classes. So I feel like I achieved a little, I had some achievements recruiting students to our Russian language classes. And our senior students, several of them applied for Fulbright Fellowship to do research in Ukraine and Russia. So I had 3 students from my class winning this Fulbright Fellowship, and eventually after coming back from Russia and Ukraine, they went to the graduate school. So I also think it's
So you're really looking at what courses they took and what did they go on and other career things. Okay, so maybe we can move on.
Okay.
All right.
You're handing it to me?
Yep, I'm
Okay.
handing it to
And
Sherry.
I'm gonna actually stand up. I loved the ideas that were being put out there about, how do we know our students are getting it, whatever it is. Brad Osgood might call it the X factor in the course. And, the student who comes back several years later and says, I realize now that that experience I had in that course has enabled me to do these wonderful things. I would challenge us all to also think about, how are we knowing it in terms of the kind of activities that are embedded in our class, in that 10-week period. How are we seeing the evidence that they've done or are achieving what we're hoping they're achieving? And so I'm going to use some examples from a class that I'm currently teaching, Introduction to Solid Mechanics, and I'll be running off at 1:15 because I'm teaching this class at 1:30 today. And, in some ways you'd look at this course as a list of 10 weeks of topics, and that's the first column. They're all nouns, not verby at all. The verby part comes on the next column, the hands-on activities, and some learning outcomes on the right-hand side. I'd like to show you some examples within the context of this course of how I've been experimenting with looking at that evidence. Are they getting it in terms of objectives? And so let me show you some examples. So on December 1st, I'm going to be doing this activity with my students, and I've been doing this for about the last 5 years. And students will be given a large sheet of paper, an 11 by 17 sheet by themselves, with a circle in the center, a list of example concepts we've covered in the class, and a list of, over on the right-hand side, connector words. And all of those are examples. And I'm asking them to create a concept map of all these topics in their heads. And they can put in that center thing whatever they want from this list. They could choose to put other things. But it's a way for me to start to see how are they connecting these ideas. And there's really no one unique way, because how they make sense of this is going to be different than how I make sense or how the person next to them makes sense. But it helps them to articulate what is the sense they're making of it. And it allows me to see, are there some things missing with how they're connecting the ideas in the class to a broader understanding. And here's just a conceptualized concept map. And Carl so wonderfully reminded me, concept maps are not trivial things, and I give them an example of one before I task them with doing it. But I want to actually show you the kind of examples. And you might say, you know, this is an engineering class and there's a tuna fish, and it was what the student added. Her final project in this class was on tuna fish. And she'd been doing research in someone else's lab and was applying the idea of equilibrium to understanding fish movement. So this was her concept map of the course. Here's another student's, and the thing I'll point out here is, even though this is a course about engineering analysis, and she put that in that center circle, right below that you see a circle called design. And you notice how she put everything connected to design. So for her, those ideas were all relevant to this idea of being a designer, and she happened to be a product design major. Here's another student's example of, you know, taking all those ideas and connecting them. So for me, I've been using this as evidence about, are they getting it? Or are they seeing connections between the meaningful parts of the class and in what way they do it? We've done further analysis. You can look at the depth of understanding, the sophistication of the understanding in this, and take it on as a research project. But for my students, it's primarily a way for them in the last week of classes to make sense of those ideas that the class covered. So this is week 10. Another example is problem sets, and you've probably have heard about the ubiquitous engineering course problem sets that students work on, and you know, evidence that they can do the calculations. And so those problem sets include a lot of equations and drawings, but they also include cases around ethics. And how do you take the work of those calculations and embed it in the larger context of what engineering students, or what engineering, how engineering is played out. And so these problem sets to me is another form of evidence in terms of, are they internalizing and learning to practice the habits of being an engineer, not only in terms of the math and the physics, but also the larger contextual issues. So P sets are another form of evidence for me. And then another one that I'll show you, which happens weeks 6 and 7, is design work. So students here, I've done a project involving hardware, as well as documentation in terms of a formal report, and they're putting those ideas together to actually build an artifact and test the performance of that artifact, and then tell the story of the creation of that artifact and its behavior, if you will. And so this really encompasses, in my mind, a mini example of being an engineer and the kind of things that you pull together in being an engineer. So for me, these are forms of evidence, you know, within the 10-week period. Are my students getting it? And you know, what I love about looking at these measures during the quarter, for those that are getting it, one can say, great work, you know, keep it up. And for those that aren't, you know, it's really an opportunity to say, you know, you might consider this, that whole formative part of working with students. So if we take those, you know, examples, problem sets, that concept map, and that project, they really are representations, or what my students are really doing to ideally achieve what I think are the three main objectives of this class. And one is to apply analytical skills to evaluate structural response of systems in static equilibrium. So that was embedded in the problem sets. It was embedded in the design of that wooden bridge. And it's embedded in how do they connect that idea with the particular concepts to do that in that concept map. They have to explain and demonstrate the role of equilibrium analysis and modeling play in engineering design and engineering applications more generally. So that example of that the ethics case is really them articulating the role of engineering in decision-making and human safety, public safety, and then they're communicating through equations, but also oral presentations. So for me, you know, those activities are really putting into action these three concepts. Now, these course objectives didn't just happen, and they aren't the ones that I've been using with this course since I've been teaching. You know, these are the 2015 version of them. If you looked at 2001, so I've been teaching a version of this class for a number of years. And, you know, I've gone from 4 to 3, and, you know, maybe next year I'll go up to 5. So I really want to put out there that objectives change as students change, as a course in the bigger landscape of their experiences change. So it's an evolutionary sort of thing. But the other thing I want to point out is the difference in the verbs going from 2001 to 2015. You know, so I had wonderful words in 2001 of better understanding, stronger analytical skills. They'll have an understanding, an intuitive feel, and questioning mind. And what I've been learning over this period is those are hard things to see in terms of my student work. You know, how do I know that they have an intuitive feel? So, you know, in working with CTL over the years and the broader community, really becoming much more trained and educated about verbs that, in fact, will be tied to the kind of assignments that I'll be giving to my students. So, you know, if we talk again next year, I suspect these will continue to get refined and more tightly tied to the kind of activities that my students are being challenged with in the course. So one of the things when I showed you this, there's a little box at the bottom that says additional question on other side. And so the students December 1st, or actually in prior years, would have turned this over for another part of this reflection assignment. And I want to show you that. And it was, in fact, my asking them based on 5 objectives on a scale of -1 or something to +1, mostly or not, some sort of Likert scale, kind of saying to what extent did the course help them achieve that. And then over on the far right-hand column are from all the stuff that they did in the class, which elements of it did they actually feel contributed to their learning on that. And this is, again, a reflection for them and very useful information for me in terms of what's impactful about the course for them in terms of their learning. With the new evaluation system, I don't have to do this in the sense that I can start including, all of us can be including those objectives right in the survey that our students will be taking. I'll just show you a little example for me that's been really useful. So, you know, for this particular student on explaining the foundations for concepts, it was almost highly achieved, and for them, the lecture was really useful. For another student here, on that same metric, number 3, they say that the bridge assignment and, let's see, the gummy bear assignment. So they build gummy bear towers on the second day of class with playing cards and scissors and tape. So, you know, looking at this for a class of 80 or 100 lets you see what's impactful and what isn't. I did want to show one of these because on this one, the students said homeworks. So those problem sets do have impact for some students too. So I won't be doing this anymore. I'm a little sad about that, but you know, I'm really glad that the new course evaluation form, in fact, lets me in a systematic way get some of this same sort of information. So with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Russell, who's really been leading the effort and leading a committee and now the university in terms of thinking about how do we all articulate stronger learning objectives.
My name is Russell Berman. I am chairing the course evaluation committee that designed the new process, and I want to say a few words about the bigger picture that led us to this result, and then some aspects of the process that are still going to be before you. The way I see it, at stake here is really the status of teaching or teaching and learning within the research university. We know that there can be some great teaching in the research university, but that is not always the case, and has certainly not always been the case. There's a certain kind of tension historically between the scholar as researcher and the scholar who's successful in eliciting learning from his or her students. That's begun to change in the United States. It began to change at Stanford, I believe, especially in the 1990s. There's a long process. Even before that, there was a Center for Teaching and Learning. I see Michelle Marinkovich here, who led that so successfully for so many years. Commission on Undergraduate Education. More recently, the SUS, the Study of Undergraduate Education at Stanford. That was the immediate catalyst, really, for the call to establish a committee to develop a new course evaluation system. The old form, many of you are familiar with it, was in place for a long, long time. A lot of dissatisfaction in the faculty, even more dissatisfaction among the students. We interviewed, we did focus groups with hundreds of students. We polled the faculty widely and came up with the new result. The provost charged us, particularly, to develop an instrument that would be customizable for each class, so that the students would not have the one-size-fits-all discouragement, and that faculty would be able to get more textured input to the real course that they teach. Customizability, of course, means complication. It necessarily involves adding another step, and many of the instructors in the room will have completed the customization for this first round of course evaluations. I haven't seen the final figures, but it looks like close to 40% participation rate, which I think is just great. Faculty have been able to customize their learning goals, so what Sherry was talking about. Also to ask about specific aspects of courses, course components, the Gummy Bear Project, for example, right? And to add questions of your own. We believe that the main effects of the new course evaluation system will be twofold. They'll get us all better information, but they're also going to have performative effect. They're going to encourage faculty to begin to articulate learning goals, and I'm convinced that we as a community are going to go through a learning curve over several years as to how to articulate learning goals more effectively. I'll be frank about it, there's a debate in the faculty, nationally. Should learning goals be very, very specific, or should they be more broad, more higher level? Should we just have a few? Should we have many? The form gives you flexibility on this point. You'll have to decide what works, what you think is going to work for you, and then try to do it better next time around. That's our community's learning goal, learning curve that's going to be ahead of us. A couple of other aspects of the form that I want to mention. The old form, there were 36 discrete items. Students would have to fill out multiple forms for team-taught courses. Students really objected to this process, objected in such a way that I know that the kind of information that we thought we were gathering was maybe less reliable than we thought. Students would often forget exactly which course it is that they were filling out the evaluation form for. There would be, during the period in which they'd be filling these out, course evaluation parties with an ambience that would mitigate against sober evaluation. This is much shorter, but more important, and this is really our next frontier. Students really did not understand why we would do this, and they certainly did not believe that instructors took this seriously. For those of you who've been here for a while, you'll remember we had the old hard copy forms. They were distributed in class, and then they'd be collected and be carried over to the registrar's office. When we went online, we lost that. We're going to stay online, not to worry. But what we want to do is recreate that moment where the faculty member says, now it's time for course evaluations, and I take these seriously. When we lost that, we as instructors lost a really important moment in our connection to students. And we're therefore asking instructors to set aside 10 to 15 minutes during the last week of classes. This will be the week you return from Thanksgiving, and to tell students why we're doing this, and that they can now work on their tablet, on their laptop, on their phone, and begin to do this. They may complete it then. They have until the end of examination period to submit. They have to submit for this to count. Instructors will be receiving from the Course Evaluation Committee a message with the details about this, with some suggested language that you may want to use. Some of you may want to use our language. You don't have to. Use your own language. The point is, it's really about establishing what the provost called in the charge to the committee the learning partnership. That's what we lost when we lost that moment in the classroom, and we're trying to reestablish that. One other aspect that I want to underscore that I believe is going to be very important for the campus culture of learning at Stanford, also to a certain extent a return to the past. It may interest you to know that course evaluations began at Stanford many decades ago as a student initiative. This is an opportunity for students to tell other students what they thought. And only gradually was it taken over by the faculty and the registrar and et cetera, and it became I think, a more effective tool for information gathering. Nonetheless, what we lost along the way as well was that student-to-student voice. And this is why in recent years, students have been flocking to outside of Stanford systems, to course rank, now gone, to rate my professor, to et cetera. None of those places are good. They have no way to screen as to whether the student, the quote, student filling out the evaluation was really in the class. On our form, we know you have to be enrolled in the class to fill it out. There will be one question: what would you like to tell other students who are considering taking this class in the future? And the results of that will go online and be visible to the student community. I think this is going to be good for the Stanford community, and it shows the students that we really are taking their voices seriously. So please do make use of that 10 to 15 minutes in the last week of class, and underscore that evaluation and student voice is important.
Great, thank you. I think we have another 5-minute activity here, and then we'll have time for questions. So be patient if you have something you'd like to ask, and we'll have an open discussion after.
Yeah, so Rob and I are just going to wrap things up here before we open up, but I've worked with lots of faculty and actually quite a few students on evaluating learning goals in many courses, and so I want to offer just a useful sort of checklist of some simple basic things to think about when you're thinking about learning goals for your course. I mean, the first thing when I say is, for creating useful learning goals, what does useful mean and who are they useful to? And basically, they're useful to 3 groups. One is the students. They get a better idea of what they're supposed to be learning in the course and what the course is about. They're useful to other faculty. They're faculty who are preparing courses to go into your course, or the follow-up ones in a sequence. They now will be able to tell much better what they can expect the students to get out of it. And finally, they're useful to you. If you've done this job carefully, you can really think about what you're going to have the students focus on, what kind of problems to give them, what kind of assessment, and so on. You end up with a much more coherent and therefore more effective course. So just a few things that I'll go over you want to think about is, first, do you have to be able to read your mind to really know what attaining this goal would mean? And basically anything that starts out with understand means they got to read your mind, because knowing the context, knowing the level of defining understanding, I mean, I've seen that used for, you could take understanding electricity, and that could be a fine first-year physics goal. It also could be a fine goal for third-year graduate courses I know about. And so you know, that you just have to think about making this so other people make sense of it. One good test of that is just, okay, can a person look at this and see why it would apply to just this course rather than 5 other courses in the department at different levels. The third, and hearing people talk about this in this group, it's very clear that affective goals, what the student's how this is going to affect their life and their future perspective on things is very important. And those are, those can and should be valuable goals for you. And there are ways you can assess that more immediately than waiting 5 years and see what they do. You can ask them, as a result of this course, are you more likely to major in this field? Are you more likely to take another course in this field? And that gives you a immediate measure. It's not perfect, but some measure of how well that was working for you. I won't go through all of these in detail. It's quite useful in thinking about goals to look at your past exams, because you were trying to measure something you thought was important. Make sure those are reflected in the goals, or can sometimes help you rethink how you're making exams, but that's often handy. And then finally, as people have talked about, there's no perfect way to come out with goals, but I found a lot of people find it easiest to start out with 3 or 4 very broad goals. In my own class, I end up with 2 quite general content goals. One is an affective goal about the subject, and the other is kind of a goal about learning physics. And then in such broad things, though, it doesn't, it's limited on how well it helps the students, and it's limited to how well it helps you align with the course, because you've got all these much more detailed things. And so then one can have quite a number of additional, oftentimes a few dozen, additional sort of specific topic goals, which to a large extent really define what you mean by these broader goals. So that's just a way that we've seen a number of people find it easier to tackle this problem. So that's just a few general ideas to think about, and I'll turn it over to Robin.
All right. So we'll pick up with those ideas and plenty of opportunity to dig deeper in this as we think about resources, and we have Q&A coming up. I'd like to transition to that with a couple of points related to things that are just flat difficult for learners, things that are hard for novices to do, and that some consideration of well-articulated learning goals really can help. And for the first of these, I'll put my professor hat on. The first half of my academic career, I was a geology professor. And one of the biggest gifts that I got in that role, when I wasn't really thinking clearly about my goals, and I certainly wasn't articulating them very well to my students, was when I had an environmental geology course, and I asked them on the first day, I essentially set a challenge that I knew would be tough. They probably wouldn't know much about this, but I wanted to know what they knew. I set that challenge to them. It was clearly related to a goal I valued, that they could carry the knowledge at the end of this course into something practical in their own lives in the future. Then put it away. Teach the course, all the important things they need to know in a very traditional fashion. Then at the end, last day of classes, set the challenge for them again. What do you know about this now? How would you address this problem now? And of course, they filled it out with a lot of detail. I did it for one purpose, to see myself, did my course get them where I wanted to get them? It taught me something completely different, though. It taught me that students can have major transformation toward our learning goals and not be aware of it. Because when they compared their end results of that challenge to what they walked in the first day with, they said, wow, I learned something in this course. I'm like, well, of course you did, right? But the epiphany for me then was, for the first time on my course evaluations, those end-term evaluations that we pay attention to, for the first time in the open-ended responses, students were telling me about what they learned and less about what I was doing, less about my teaching and more about their learning. And at that point, that idea became a tool for me to help them think about their progress toward learning goals. So I think that's a takeaway, is that that's a difficult thing for learners to do, to assess their strengths and weaknesses toward our goals. And as we think about course design, to build that in. I would transition then with my other hat, which for the last 16 years has been in a teaching and learning support role. And we've got a team of folks at VPTL now who have looked at thousands of student comments, either through mid-quarter feedback or through end-term feedback where faculty are asking for us to help them interpret and respond. One of the things that's universally difficult for students is to see the organizational structure of a course. We always have an organizational structure. We may or may not tell them what it is well, but even when we tell them what it is well, it is a difficult thing for them to keep their heads around. So that things that we see as beautifully connected, as Sherry's concept map showed earlier, are still disjointed pieces in a student's mind. Having learning outcomes that are clear, thinking about how we revisit them with students along the way, tying the course to that infrastructure, is a way to help make more visible to students something that's generally very difficult for them. And it helps them to see what those threads of the course are. So I'm a big fan for all kinds of reasons, and I think what I want to do now is really transition us into an opportunity for some questions and answers. The panel is here now for everyone except Sherry, I guess, who does need to run off and teach. We're here for a good chunk of time more. We'd like to invite you to the microphones, and please introduce yourself at the mic and then pose questions.
Hi, I'm Dave Jaffe. I'm a lecturer in mechanical engineering, and I'm here representing my faculty colleagues, students who have deep fundamental concerns about the course evaluation process and policies. I'm going to go through a few of them. Professor Drew Nelson comments about how the subjective nature of the evaluations are being transformed into an objective measure with 2 decimal places of precision. My office mate, Paul Mitigee, observes that students have many biases, both conscious and unconscious, as well as preferences and other issues unrelated to teaching and learning that affect their evaluations. And in a staff meeting a couple weeks ago, Professor Larry Leifer asked faculty if they had ever been rewarded for their excellent evaluations. There were no hands raised. And in surveying my students over the past 3 years under the old system, only one student knew that a very good, a 4, was a minimum passing grade for lecturers. All students who gave a good evaluation, thinking they were providing a positive evaluation, said they would change their score had they known they were actually failing their lecturer. And for math, it's common practice in statistical methods to report the value of the mean, and it should be the same order of magnitude as the standard deviation. So consider a class where everybody except one student gave the same course score, evaluation score. It would take a class of well over 200 students to justify the 2 decimal places, and a class of 91 students to justify 1 decimal place, a standard deviation of 0.1. So it's not a question, it's just an observation from my colleagues and my students, and I'm going to just leave it up to you to judge the relevance and importance of these concerns. Thank you.
Thanks for those comments. Those, in fact, apply to any existing course evaluation system, the old one as well as the new one. I think to the new one, frankly, less than to the old one. With regard to reporting, we've been arguing against the focus on the single number and are providing a reporting where you'll be able to see, or your supervisors will be able to see, the whole distribution. We've argued very strongly to different schools that they should not focus on the single number, and frankly not to use the course evaluation form in isolation from other metrics of performance. Our charge, the charge of the committee, frankly, was not about summative evaluations at all, but to focus rather on formative aspects, how the feedback might inform the instructor. And I think we've given it a good shot. I think this is better than the old form. What we found, as I said, with the old form, that what we thought we were collecting as definitive information was, frankly, in some cases, pseudo-information. We've learned that, we know nationally that there's lots of literature that shows that there are other biases that operate in these course evaluations, which is why, again, we counsel to the to chairs and deans not to place too much credence in the validity of these forms for purposes of career decisions. We suggest other kinds of ways to measure the success of teaching and learning. That said, I don't think we want to stop listening to students as to how they respond to courses. The fact that some students have biases is not a reason to silence all students. This is one piece of information among lots of others. On the points of, you made a number of points, I'm not sure if I'm hitting all of them, that the sense that no one was ever rewarded for excellence in teaching, aside maybe for those people who've received excellence in teaching rewards. This was raised on the floor of the Senate, and the provost said, he reported, that chairs and deans look at these and take them into consideration at salary setting. I've been a department chair, and I've looked at course evaluations and taken them into consideration. Whether this is practiced across the university, I don't know. That I will say as chair of the course evaluation committee. As a faculty member who participates in this stuff and watches the culture of this university and others, I think that there should be a much more emphatic carving out of part of the salary pool that is designated specifically for teaching success. And we haven't done that formally. I think we could do better on it.
Russell, one other thing I might add to that, you know, maybe there could be a cultural shift at this point. We all tend to get these reviews, whatever they are, and we may or may not look at them for a while because of shock and not wanting to look at them. You know, I tend to with my winter ones in the past. I don't look at them until January because I want to have a good Christmas break or holiday break. That's not a healthy way to use these forms. In fact, they should spawn conversation, you know, that a group of faculty would get together and say, here were some of the responses, what am I going to do with this, you know, and use each other as sounding boards and part of a design team to move forward with our courses. So, you know, I don't know how we get to that cultural shift in terms of making it more public.
Yeah. Yes. What she said. I mean, I'm glad that you had this conversation with your colleagues about course evaluation forms. In fact, we know from surveys that most faculty don't talk about course evaluations with other faculty, and that's a crying shame. And the intent of the committee, actually in structuring some of these questions, was to provide fodder for program and department level conversations. We really have to deprivatize this, deprivatize the teaching experience. We can learn from each other as to what's working in the classroom. I think it's too often the case, at least in parts of universities, that faculty don't know what their faculty colleagues, lecturers don't necessarily know what their lecturer colleagues are teaching. We have to share syllabi. We should talk about course evaluations with each other, and that's the real cultural change.
Right. So I want to just thank publicly Russell and the committee for all the hard work that they've done to develop a new teaching course evaluation process. A tremendous amount of thoughtful discussion and effort went into this, and I think the result is really tremendous and a great tool. And I think it's also great to hear from some of the discussion that you've had. I also feel, as Russell said, that none of that really, to me, sounds specific about the change in the course evaluation process. And so I'd like to take that as constructive input. And if you have more discussions and can figure out ways to use the tools that we're all working on to greater advantage in your department and elsewhere, that'd be great. Why don't we take some other perspectives?
Professor Berman, I have a question. Did I get the idea that every quarter we can change our course evaluation forms? Is this a one-time effort, or did I hear between lines that it's going to be a changing for the instructor to go into this process?
There will be an opportunity to customize every quarter. if you want to carry it over, there'll be a way to copy, so you don't have to repeat the effort. In some parts of the university, there are some instructors who will teach the same course over several quarters or repeatedly every year, and then you can copy. But of course, your attitude, your understanding of your course may evolve as well. So even if you're teaching the same course, maybe you're going to adjust your learning goals. So yeah, you'll have your flexibility to re-customize, but also to carry over.
We are in the first year of rollout, so we'll see how it all goes, and I'm sure it will not go perfectly, but it should be a good, fun experience.
Hi, Mark Applebaum, Music Department. I want to say thank you for what I consider a market improvement, and so I applaud this initiative. And there are many attributes of the new evaluations that I like. I want to express one quibble, sure. And that is, and I appreciate that. I understand that students get fatigued, and we want to be sensitive to that and not make them too long, so there's a limitation to the questions that can be asked. And I like that first area or second area that captures where you can choose 3 to 5 aspects of a course and receive feedback, such as textbooks or field trips and so forth. The problem with that, I don't remember the wording, but I think it asks students to comment on the quality of, say, a textbook, if I remember correctly. And the problem is, I may want to ask the question, was this a well-written textbook? And that's very different than, was this a sensible and relevant adoption? What was it impactful in your own learning and in the outcome that you experienced, and and so forth. So there are some, I can imagine some confusion in terms of how a student might respond to that. Yeah. And if I may, so that's one, and then if I may just add a separate question, thank you, that is about learning goals. My understanding is that I was taught a long time ago that it's a good idea to make learning goals first, and then instruments of evaluation second, and then assignments and lecture topics and things like that third, whereas most of us are inclined to start with that third. We get very excited about, there's going to be a lecture on this, and there's going to be a lab on this, and there's going to be an event that does this, and so forth. So I'm a little bit concerned, like Sherry, I was fascinated because by your, I appreciated learning that the idea that learning goals can be dynamic. But what if your 2001 goals were really right on? I was inferring that that you were maybe, you said something that struck me, that you were adapting the learning goals to describe what in fact you were doing in the content of the course. And then similarly, is it Bill?
Carl.
Oh, Carl, I'm sorry. By looking at, it's useful to look at all exams. I mean, I'm in complete agreement with that, but that sort of tilts again towards the, let's make our learning goals based on something that we did, as opposed to doing something that aspires to extend those learning goals. I'm sorry if this is forward, untoward or impolite. I just wanted to press on that a little bit.
No, that's a very good question, and I think I'll let Sherry answer for her part. But what I'm looking at there is, this is looking at old exams is really just a guide for people of trying to come up with articulating something, because so many people kind of come in, well, I want them to really understand these different topics, but then you have to move that from that level to what do I mean by understanding? What is it that they need to be able to do, okay? And so that's what I'm saying, is that exams are, in many cases, people's best efforts in the past to lay out what they want students to be able to do. And so it's simply a guide. Now, I would say maybe in working with other faculty, maybe half the time they end up saying, oh yeah, that captures it better. The other half the time they say, no, that doesn't really capture what I'm thinking at all. That's what I end up with an exam, but I really need to modify things in a meaningful way. So no, this isn't something you should learn there. It's just to kind of sometimes help your thinking about it. And I would say that in workshops on this, as we've kind of evolved with faculty, one useful thing is we have them come up with, they're trying to think of the learning goals for their class, come up with, you know, a detailed, specific learning goal. At the same time, think of how you would assess that, okay? And so that really makes it kind of real, okay? And so here's the learning goal, and then, we don't let you walk away unless you come up with some way of assessment. Now, you know, that might be exams, it might be surveys of opinions, it might be projects, and et cetera. But at least it's forcing you to get definite about it. And the great thing about getting, you know, definite or operationalize it is then you can think about how to make your teaching aligned with that too. But you always want to keep in mind that you fundamentally want to make sure the learning goal really reflects something that you see as important. And, you know, if the rest of your course doesn't match that, then you need to change the rest of the course. On the other hand, if you want to do stuff in the rest of the course that doesn't match the learning goal, okay, that's a bad learning goal.
So, great observation, and you know, in some ways, it's because of how we laid this session out in terms of having all of you think about what does evidence look like, and so my kind of showing evidence, and ultimately that has to represent the goals. And so the goals do come first, and the activities really are in response to achieving it. I would say, though, in terms of the evolution of goals, I mean, I expect mine will continue because the technologies are changing that are available to use in teaching and learning. Engineering tools are changing, and the relationship of my course to the other student experiences continue to change. So, you know, continuing to go back to them to say, are these as the most relevant in 2015 or 16? Yeah. So I appreciate your kind of saying, well, are you doing an inductive thing of kind of looking at the instances and wrapping it up into a title that works for you? And no, it's the other way around, the objectives coming first. Good observation.
So here's a quick question. Does anybody in the room, as a student, when you were a student, does anyone in the room ever remember being surprised on a final exam? Thank you, Sherry. Thank you. Does anyone ever remember being surprised or shocked on a final exam or a big question or a paper with, where did this come from? Most of us remember, like you actually remember where you were because it was a very emotionally upsetting. That was a course that had a very significant learning goal embedded at the end that somehow you had not been part of working toward or understanding was a goal and participating. So this idea of designing the course to meet those is critical.
So, Mark, let me just respond. Those are great questions. There were two. People have responded mainly to the second one, which really shows that the learning goals, which we ask about on the evaluation form, are really just a wedge to get into course design more broadly, and I think that's the next stage. You all are here to learn about this stuff. You've indicated that you thought about this. My sense is that it's not necessarily the case that across the university there's so much intentionality going on into teaching, and that's really the big agenda. With regard to the first point regarding the scale for those questions, yeah, we see this as an iterative process. There may be some things we want to tweak. There is the opportunity for you to add other questions if you want to dig down deeper into the judgment on the textbook. And we also felt strongly that the end quarter student course evaluation, this is just one metric. There are other ways you can ask questions of your students.
Stu Levin, Geophysics. I see the students signing up for courses, and then by the third week or even the first week, they're dropping courses or even withdrawing after the deadlines. It would be very useful to have some feedback where you can say, why did you drop? Why did you withdraw? Was it personal reasons? Was it the course didn't appear to be what was advertised? So that could help us early in the stage rather than late in the stage shape the courses and target them more correctly.
Yeah, great idea.
Agreed. Yeah.
So, I mean, for you to really be able to do that effectively also brings up a point that I don't think we've talked about, but I mean, if you and the students could see what the learning goals, detailed learning goals for these courses, that would help that a lot. Now that's, something beyond the current system, but with a little work probably could be produced. Certainly the department could work on that.
That doesn't seem like it should necessarily be a personal secret. If this is what your course is going to be about, and this is what you're going to try to convey to students, then shouldn't you all be proud of the learning goals you have in your courses?
Yeah, but that's premised on the assumption that faculty know the syllabi of the other courses in their department, and I think this is not necessarily the case.
Well, we could learn that too. I mean, why not? It's
but right now, the syllabi don't really tell you. Learning goals tell you something. I don't know, the syllabi say understand the first 7 chapters of this book.
Yeah, but the syllabi should have the learning goals, right?
All right, all right. Let's stop being so academic. Let's hear from somebody in the audience.
Oh, hi. I'm Dan Lassiter from Linguistics and Symbolic Systems. I wonder if there is a certain bias toward certain kinds of hard sciences in the way that we're framing these problems. So in particular, I can absolutely understand if I were teaching a course in engineering or physics or so forth, that it would make a lot of sense to equate understanding with particular skills. But I think there are many fields in which that equation is not reasonable. So I mean, in particular, when I was an undergraduate, 2 of the best courses that I took, one was in history of psychiatry and one was in the history of constitutional law. And it would have been, I think, a loss for the course if we had equated doing well in the class, the goal of the class, with being able to perform any particular task at the end of the class. The goal was really to think deeply, to read deeply, and to understand. And if we had just said, you need to be able to write a passable 3-paragraph essay about X, Y, or Z, that would not have been as good a class. And I feel this in a lot of my teaching as well, that sometimes there are particular skills that you absolutely must have, but sometimes what we want the students to do is just think, understand, engage deeply. Is there a place for this?
Yeah, I think I think your initial assertion is questionable. I mean, I think that, and I talked with humanities faculty about this very point, and so I'll take the one you say, read deeply, okay? Now, the faculty, especially if they're a good faculty member in that area, they have a very clear idea of what it means to read deeply, and they have certain standards that they apply, and I'll go out on a limb here and sort of paraphrase what literature faculty are telling me about what they mean by reading deeply, okay? So reading a passage of text, and you don't just look at what the words mean, you think about the context in which this was written, you think about the perspectives of the writer, and and there's several other things that really go into how it connects with other literature, philosophy of the period, et cetera. And so these are things that are really define what they mean by read deeply, and there are quite reasonable things to evaluate if the student can do those or not. So I think if you sort of turn this around and you say, okay, I'm teaching this subject, and I want students to learn to think deeply, what would be an indication to me that they're thinking deeply or they're not thinking deeply? Because the negative is just as effective at figuring out how to assess it. And so I think to the extent there always are in these disciplines really kind of well-defined standards and things people can do, you can define those perfectly well as learning goals. Now, are they going to be possible tests on a multiple choice test? No, but there are ways. We wouldn't have courses if we didn't have ways to assess them. And so people have their ways of assessing them, and that can reflect the goals. A lot of them, it's writing a long paper. What do you look for when you look at a student's paper? What makes it good or bad? And so I think if you just then thinking about, okay, I'll write goals that are reflect that.
So this question often comes up, so I'm glad you asked it. Russell, would you like to comment on this a little bit?
Sure. I'm from the humanities, and we've had a humanities education focus group that Carl came to speak at, and there is a certain amount of translation that has to go on from the natural science world into the humanities world. But if I read and try to evaluate an end quarter paper, then I'll be looking at the quality of the claims made. It'll be Carl hit on some of the key ones. Draw effective connections between text and context. That's still at a very abstract level, but sometimes those historicization of texts are less successful than others. Recognize multiple voices in a fictional narrative. Be able to connect historical documents with larger narrative claims in a history course. This is off the top of my head right now, but I think these are the kinds of, I'll say, skills, abilities, cognitive capacities that we want to cultivate in our students beyond the material mastery, some of which, of course, is also important. We want them to be better thinkers, readers, and this is what we'd be, in the end, if I'm going to grade a paper, this is the kind of stuff I'm going to look for, and I'd want to then be able to look at these operations, re-articulate them as learning goals, and that's what would show up on my course evaluation forms.
And just to come at this from the other side, the natural sciences, I mean, one shouldn't be so limited as to, be able to do exactly these precise things. There's many things where in science engineering where you'd have a goal of, I want to have students, recognize the relevance of this to some, broad range of contexts and, or recognize how they might apply it. And so I'm speaking to the natural science people of, don't limit yourself into what you're thinking of also, that there are broader, more important things, and you should try and make sure those are reflected in the goals and in your teaching.
I think that's a great question to end on. So thank you all for enjoying lunch together and the conversation and pitching in with your questions.
Yeah, so as we wrap up, we know there may be questions in the room that didn't get a voice. Please do a favor for us. You still have some blank cards there. We'd like for you to take a moment and let us know what your most important takeaway from this session was, what questions you might still have. And this can be anonymous if you wish, but if you would like us to reach back out to you to discuss something more, please put your name and contact information and we'll be in touch. And I guess I would also close with saying what I've heard a number of our colleagues say up here. This is a community effort. Coming together and talking about teaching, thinking about learning goals, getting feedback from colleagues is something that we best do together and with resources. So I would remind you of the December 4th event. If you want to come roll your sleeves up and spend some time working on objectives in a community of folks working the same direction, please join us for that. There's still room to register. And in general, let us help you reach out and build community, whether it's in your department or across departments, with what you're trying to do in articulating your teaching for your students.
Great. And one more thing. I mean, it's a little bit hard in a forum like this to respond to a list of 47 grievances, but I appreciate all the thought that went into that. If anybody else has a list that long, shorter, similar, send it to me, and I'd be glad to hear what your thoughts are. Thank you.
Thank you.